Hi, everyone, and welcome to the book talk Trans Studies in K through 12 Education, Creating an Agenda for Research and Practice. A reminder that chat is disabled for attendees, but if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A feature below. I would like to introduce the book's editors who have joined us here today. Mario Suarez is Assistant Professor of Cultural Studies at Utah State University. He previously taught high school math in Austin, Texas, and his work has been featured on NPR Ed and Univision. Melinda Mangan is professor in the Department of Education Theory, Policy, and Administration in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. Professor Mangan's work draws upon a variety of theoretical lenses, including queer, instructional, and distributed leadership, learning, and organizational theories. Thank you, Melinda and Mario, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, wherever you're joining us virtually from. Good morning for those of you on the West Coast, good afternoon, or good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. My name is Mario Suarez. I'm here with my colleague Melinda Mangan. We're the editors of this book. First off, before we begin, we would like to give our we're very grateful and deeply grateful for the publishing team at Harvard Ed Press for working with us throughout this whole time, this last 2 years, to make this book come to fruition. So hopefully you'll get to learn a little bit more about it today. And then if you have any more questions, Melinda and I are both more than happy to answer them off-site. And I'll leave it off to Melinda to get us started.
Thanks, Mario. And I want to just reiterate, if there's ever a hard time to work on a book, it's during COVID, and we had a really wonderful production team. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about the production process. We were really fortunate to receive a Spencer Foundation conference grant, which allowed us to convene a small group of 20 folks to get together and try to map out an agenda for education research that would focus on improving the experiences and outcomes of trans students and trans educators. So we brought together a diverse group of scholars and professionals. We wanted to make sure we didn't have just academics at the table, especially because academia doesn't represent trans folks very well. So we wanted to make sure we had professionals from the field who are also engaged around this topic. So we had a range of disciplinary traditions. We had sociologists and anthropologists and policy folks. We also had a range of methodologies from quantitative researchers as well as qualitative researchers, and career backgrounds. The majority of the participants were trans and or genderqueer. And we really spent the 3 days engaged in collaboration, really trying to figure out what it is that we know and to develop some shared understanding, and then also to try to map out where we'd like to see the field go. This is just a quick list of the participants who joined us for that conference. Most of these folks contributed to the edited volume, although not all of them. So it was a very fluid process, and we brought on the right people to make sure that we were able to develop a book that would really meet the needs of the field. And so this is the book, Trans Studies in K-12 Education. And you can see you can access it in a number of different places, but if you access it through Harvard Ed Press, there's a 20% discount code. And I'm going to come back to this slide later on at the end, and so don't worry about trying to jot down that code if you don't have it handy. And Mario, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Yeah, we had a series of goals, all of these which kind of came from the conference that Melinda just talked about. And so the first was bridging the field of trans studies, which is primarily based in the humanities, and the field of K-12 education, these are both fields that don't always speak to each other. So we wanted to make sure that was one of the main goals that was evident throughout the book. We wanted to create a space for the very terminologies that reflect the dynamic nature of gender as it's fluid and it's evolving, continues to evolve. We wanted to promote trans epistemologies and knowledge production and inform it by trans people, which Melinda just alluded to earlier on. We wanted to influence future research and practice to affirm trans identities and experiences. Obviously, we will also wanted to improve the K-12 educational experiences for trans students and educators, and we wanted to promote the goals of equity and liberation for trans people in schools. And here's we'll do a deeper dive a little bit on the chapters. There were 6 chapters on top of the introduction and conclusion as well. So we'll do a deeper dive into each one of them. I'll talk about the first one. It's a collaboration with my colleague Harper Keenan out of University of British Columbia, and this particular chapter, we reconsider contemporary research and include the methods that engage knowledge produced by trans people. We begin with a review of theories and research methods that shape how trans people are understood, from the very painful historical roots to the present. And then we offer a vision of what's possible when research builds from trans people, trans knowledge and experience. And we include exemplars of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies that center trans epistemologies. We try to guide readers in the production of trans-affirming research policies and practice.
Thanks, Mario. So in chapter 2, written by Chris Mayo, Maddie Adelman, and Molly McQuillan, really took a look at what we know about the law and the policy terrain. So this chapter provides a critical examination of US laws and policies related to gender equity, identity, and expression. The authors examined the emergence, implementation, and consequences of regulatory and legal processes that are intended to either limit or affirm non-gender normative school community members. And the authors also describe the sociopolitical and legal pathways that trans students and school employees have to secure their education and workplace rights. This chapter invites readers to imagine how law and policy can be leveraged to create more liberatory educational spaces.
Chapter 3 was Life in School for Transgender and Non-Binary Students, and that one is co-authored by Caitlin Clark, Joseph Cossiu, both at GLSEN, and Patrick Hurley. The authors draw upon excellent research, including large-scale survey data to delineate trans and non-binary students' experiences in U.S. schools. They discuss the in-school resources shown to positively contribute to LGBTQ youth's school experience. And this review of in-school supports is supplemented with qualitative research on the role that parents play as advocates for the trans and non-binary children. They conclude with recommendations for future research and practice as well.
Chapter 4 is titled Accounting for Transgender in Pre-Service and In-Service Education. This chapter was authored by Elizabeth Payne, Lee Ayrton, and Melissa Smith. This chapter provides a critical review of research on learning opportunities for pre-service and in-service teachers. The authors focus on gender despite a tendency within the literature to collapse sexual and gender diversity under the umbrella of LGBTQ+. The chapter includes data on professional learning, teacher candidate readiness to support gender diverse students, and the pre-service experiences of trans and gender nonconforming teacher candidates. The authors conclude with questions about the kinds of learning that transform teachers' practice and support gender diversity.
Chapter 5 was titled Transgender at School, and it's authored and co-authored by Liz Mayer, Paige Valentine Reagan, and Kelly Jenkins. The authors explain why schools should affirm gender diversity and how to engage this work. They begin by describing how gender is socialized in school and the harmful effects on trans and non-binary people. Next, they provide examples of promising practices that can be implemented in classrooms to create gender-affirming spaces. There's vignettes from Kelly's experience teaching in K-12 schools that add valuable insights and underscore the importance of learning from trans educators and youth.
And the chapter, the penultimate chapter before the conclusion, is Community Programs for Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Youth by Lance McCready and Monty Neufeld. These authors discuss what formal education can learn from transgender and gender nonconforming specific community programs. Community programs often serve as lifelines for trans and non-binary youth who may have no resources of support from family or from school. Through a survey of out-of-school educational settings, the authors describe the ways that community programs and services address the hostile environment of K-12 schools. And I'm going to hand it off to Mario to talk a little bit about the contribution.
So those were the 6 chapters, and we end our conclusion with some of the major contributions that we find in this collection of essays, but then also some of the limitations that come from the work. So we point to the increased societal awareness of trans identities and the growing respect for trans people and experiences. There's a growing body of research that can contribute new knowledge about the education experiences of trans students and educators. We try to leverage this knowledge to develop more affirming educational spaces for trans people. However, one of the things that we noted is that though the goal of liberation must include liberation for all marginalized peoples, right, Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous, disabled, undocumented, in solidarity with trans communities, that hasn't always been seen across the field. And so we point to, the new emerging scholars in the field and make that call for greater emphasis on intersectional lenses in trans studies in K-12 education.
So as we think about next steps for ourselves moving forward, for the chapter authors and more broadly for the field, we outline some aims that we hope the field can reach for. First and foremost, we hope that future work will situate research in historical and political contexts. And we're really hoping that the field examines all facets, critically self-examines all facets of education. So this means looking at knowledge construction at all levels, examining the classroom, school, district, and state levels, and how trans epistemologies are represented or not represented, looking at the contextual conditions and the way in which those conditions influence trans people's educational experiences, for better or for worse, also looking at educational practices and how those practices affect trans and non-binary people. And we're also hoping that the field will examine educators' roles in creating gender-affirming school cultures and thinking about how to shift toward more inclusive, competent educational practices. So as part of this, we also want the field to, we want all of us as researchers to be challenging ourselves to think in new ways. And to do that means looking out.
I think Melinda froze.
Yes.
Melinda, can you hear us? I can finish off the rest of her slide. So yes, really, we wanted to make sure we challenged ourselves to thinking in new ways, particularly as researchers. We wanted to make sure that we look outward to gain new insights about what's possible, making sure that we engage with a broad range of research epistemologies, whether they be theories, methodologies, theoretical lenses, making sure that we engaged as researchers in a continual self-reflexivity, and then finally making sure that we engage ethically with and for trans communities. I think you're back, Melinda.
I'm back. Sorry about that. That was a cyber glitch. I went somewhere magical. So I'm back. Mario, do you want to? Were you able to?
I finished.
To finish
yes.
all the next steps for research. Thank you.
I did.
So we're back to this slide that we started out with. This is the book. I don't know if I've gotten a chance to pick it up yet. I don't know if the way the screen goes. I don't know if you can see it. So here it is. It's available through Harvard Ed Press. There's a discount if you use the sales code that's here. And what we'd like to do now, oh, I've got one more slide here. These are some of other works that Mario and I have worked on, both collaboratively and individually. We are so excited to share this special issue of Educational Researcher, where some of the same authors who participated in this edited volume also share their other types of scholarship. This is not a duplication of the book. This is a very different project and a different set of articles here. We encourage you to take a look. And also just a snapshot of the book that I published aimed at a teacher education audience, especially for elementary schools. So with that, we'd like to, Mario, were you going to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, we also realize that not everybody in the audience may potentially have access to educational research. So if you want to email us, because all of these are behind paywalls, we're more than happy to share some of these that we authored with you.
And on that note, we'd like to open it up for conversation and questions. We're hoping folks in the audience have maybe either insights they bring from their own work or questions you have from other projects. We're open to any kinds of questions.
Thank you. Yes, we have one question here. Can you say in lay language what trans epistemology is, i.e., is it sufficient for the person doing the research to be trans, or is there something specific about the methodologies or theories underpinning the research that has to be present to make it trans, in quotation?
That's a really great question. I can start on it, and then Melinda, you can take over if you have anything to add. Really, trans epistemology is just trans ways of knowing and learning and understanding, right? And so what Harper and I, in particular the Theories and Methods book, wanted to get the point across is that you don't have to be trans to be doing trans research, right? However, it's important to understand the history of where trans studies and how trans studies came to be. And really it came as a way of resistance, right? And making sure that we, as trans individuals, were seen and heard, because we weren't always, the part of the really harmful history on trans people is that science, and particularly the medical sciences, hasn't always, did not start being, was extremely harmful to us, right, from the very beginning. And so it's understanding that particular history, and then making sure that we are able to make it justice in the research that we do. So it's not that you don't have to be trans to be doing trans research, but also making sure that you are ethical. And so we do allude, and we talk a little bit about what are some ways that we have a couple principles that we outline in that chapter, where to be able to do ethical research with trans communities and for trans communities. I hope that answers the question.
Mario, I really like how you described trans epistemologies, and I'd add to, from my own experience, I'm a cisgender researcher, and I'm committed to the topic of improving the conditions for trans students and educators in schools. But as I engage in this topic, I've tried to be like we mentioned earlier, critically self-reflective, but also to make sure I'm surrounding myself with other trans folks, so that I can be member checking and getting insights and making sure that I'm really hearing and listening to trans communities plural, to try to do this work in a way that is ethical. I often struggle with this journey for myself and wondering whether or not I'm the right person to do this work. And I definitely don't think I'm the ideal person to do this work. But my trans friends and trans network have really encouraged me to to participate in this conversation, saying that, you know, we need lots of all hands on deck, right? And so I think doing this work thoughtfully is certainly possible from a cisgender experience, as long as we surround ourselves with all sorts of trans folks. And somebody asked for the code again. Let me backtrack to that. Thanks, Mayan.
Thank you. Yes, we have a few more questions here. Could you share a few of the highlights from the transgender at school section?
One of the things that we definitely wanted to highlight for that chapter was the contribution, the tremendous contribution of Kelly Jenkins. It's the only chapter that has vignettes from a trans-identified teacher who is currently in the schools, and just she specifically talks about how difficult it has been for her, how, you know, and it really echoes a lot what a lot of the research has talked about, is that it's been oftentimes the adults that have difficulty, right, the leaders in the schools that have difficulty with trans individuals in schools, rather than the youth. The youth have been extremely accepting of her in as she speaks to in her vignettes, and so that was the biggest highlight. And then the authors do a really great job at bringing in and pulling in from her narrative, and then bringing in the research that comes with it, and what the research speaks to.
Yeah, I could add a little bit to that as well. You know, one of the things that this chapter does is really explicitly explains how schools are sites of gender surveillance and gender policing, and the way that gender is socialized in schools. And, you know, really setting that as kind of the backdrop for school experiences, both for students and for educators. And you know, the way that gender is policed in schools affects everyone in schools, not just trans and non-binary folks, right? The right way to be a boy or the right way to be a girl is reiterated over and over again in our social structures in schools. So that's another aspect of that chapter.
Thank you. Based on the work done for this book, what do you think is the biggest challenge for folks wanting to do trans research in K through 12 schools?
I can speak a little bit to that, and then Melinda, you can jump in as well. I mean, it's no surprise, right? I mean, this book came out at the time when you know, we have 300 plus, you know, bills across the United States, and different, you know, state legislatures that are targeting not just trans youth, but also their teachers and allies too, who are trying to support them, right? Just in my own context, I live and reside in Utah, in a small town, rural town that has just currently banned pride flags across the school district, right? And so it's a very challenging time. And so some of I think, rather than doing the trans research in K-12 is more the societal resistance to it, right? And that's really making it difficult, one, to just be ourselves, to be able to live as trans individuals, and then on top of that, to be able to capture those experiences as researchers who may be trans or cis, doing this type of work. So I think that's the largest challenge right now, currently in the time we're living in, is that oftentimes we're not having that support, and it's making it a lot harder for the youth who are trying to just be themselves and exist.
Yeah, and I'll take that in a little bit different direction. I think one of the challenges that we're faced as researchers is, I think there's a huge propensity in our field to pathologize trans students and to treat trans students as a problem. And I think that a challenge for us is to move away from that, you know, diametrically, and make sure that we're attending to schools and educational contexts as the problem. And I think that, you know, I think there is pressure to continue to attend to trans students in pathologizing ways, and breaking out of that mode, I think, is an important challenge that we have to face.
Thank you. In recent years, parents and other family members have been playing an increasingly large role in conversations in gender-related topics. Is this something that the book or any of your work cover? For example, do you have recommendations for how school can work with parents on these challenging topics?
Mario, I keep letting you lead.
Oh, I thought you would be perfect for it because of your work with youth and working with parents.
You know I have an answer, but I'll let you go first.
I mean, none of my particular work specifically does this. I do know that the chapter with GLSEN, I think it's chapter number 3, Life in Schools for Transgender Students and Non-Binary Students. GLSEN does a pretty good job at kind of working through some of that. They look into the dearth of surveys that they've used throughout their time doing research. So they do a little bit of this in their chapter, but they focus mostly on youth. But I thought, Melinda, you might be able to speak a little bit more to this with some of the research that you have done, particularly in working with youth in elementary schools.
Yeah, and I wonder where's that slide we have with the other, hold on, I'm checking for it. This one. So we just have the one chapter, the GLSEN chapter, that attends to parents and family relationships. My previous work on transgender students in elementary schools does spend a more significant amount of time on that relationship between schools and families. There are lots of resources out there for families. Gender Spectrum is a prominent one. The Human Rights Campaign Welcoming Schools materials is also really helpful. One of the things, though, that is, again, a challenge for us in the field is how, in my work, a lot of the educators were engaging with families that were supportive of their trans and non-binary children. And I think one of the challenges in the field is, how do we help educators support students who don't have supportive family environments, right? So those are two radically different contexts for thinking about this work. And how do we do that in a way that is more expansive, I think is one of the topics we need to take up.
Great, thank you. As the parent of a trans teenager and a medical professional, I struggle with medicine's othering of trans individuals. As an example, many talks I go to lead with the increased risk of depression and suicide. What do you think are the most important things medical professionals should know about treating transgender children or patients in general?
That's a really great question. And one that I mean, I speak to this mostly from a non medical professional, right? I'm an education researcher, but as a trans individual, one of the things that I always advocate for is that there are aspects of our lives that are not always, just harm, depression, suicidal ideation, right? Those are huge risk factors that play a role, right? And such as parental supports at schools, all of these things play a role into these negative connotations, right? Into these negative experiences. There are pockets here and there where we're thriving, right? Where we're getting plenty of support. Sometimes in the most rural, small places and stuff, right? And so I think as researchers, it's important for us to capture those, right, at just as much, if not more, than the difficulties we're going through. Just because I completely understand is that it's this same narrative keeps getting played over and over and over again about these suicide risks, depression, suicide, dropping out of school, all of these things, right? So I think we definitely need to do a better job as well as researchers to be able to capture those moments where we're thriving. With regards to important things that medical professionals should know is just getting to know, right, the actual their student and their parents, right? What things can they help out, and also understand when they're out of their league, right? And to be able to get support from the parent and be able to listen to the parents and the students. Like they know themselves sometimes better than the medical professionals may or may not know about their medical history. Melinda, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I could add to that. I'm going to change the screen too to get back to our questions. You know, I think that some of these statistics, these scary statistics, particularly suicidality, depression, et cetera, can be a helpful leverage point, right? They help folks understand how important this is to provide appropriate medical care and you know, social supports. At the same time, you know, as we're thinking about this, I think we need to remember that trans children don't see themselves often as trans children. They just see themselves as kids, and they have all sorts of other aspects of their identity, whether they like crafts or they like soccer or they like math or art. You know, kids are kids. And so, you know, I think sometimes those of us who our researchers, medical professionals, can pigeonhole these children into this particular unifocus direction. And, you know, kids are dynamic and they have all sorts of aspects of personality to celebrate. And, you know, as Mario said, the doom and gloom, that's not who trans people are, right? That, you know, there might be societal experiences that create doom and gloom, but that's not the trans folks themselves. That's society, and we can fix that, right? So it's malleable.
Thank you. So what other books would you recommend for people who want to learn more about this topic?
So Mayan, is your question, I mean, so when we start to think about resources, right, there are resources for families, there are resources for educational researchers, there are, you know, so there's a wide range there. Are you thinking of something in particular?
Just people who want maybe specifically thinking about allies, because I think that's some more general terms. It could be educators, future educators, it could be parents, it could be friends of transgender people. But I would put it under the allyship umbrella.
Yeah, I guess
I can
I
recommend
usually, yeah, go for it, Mario.
a great, like, it's kind of gender 101 book that was written by Lee Ayrton, just recently published by Lee Ayrton, one of the contributors, I think for chapter, I believe it was chapter 6 or 5. It's called Gender Your Guide. And it does a really great job at kind of covering, you know, in a very easy to understand. It's not specifically for an academic audience. It's for pretty much anybody to read and listen to. So that one's a really great book to start off with. For teachers, particularly, that another book, textbook or book that was published also by Lee Ayrton, and it was edited by Lee Ayrton and Susan Woolley. It's called Teaching About Gender Diversity. And in that one is particular for teachers who want to be able to cover, you know, whether they're trans themselves or allies, to be able to cover gender diversity in schools. And so they do a really good job at kind of giving exemplars of lesson plans from elementary, middle school, and then high school as well. So there's a few examples of each in there to give some variety. And then there's a couple others as well, but they're a little bit more academic in nature. So for educational researchers, obviously, any work by Susan Stryker, you know, is amazing to get to understand. Susan Stryker, Riley Snorton, Jules Gill Peterson, to understand the history of transness in general, right? And in particular in the medicine, in the medical field, and to be able to understand the background of the harms of pathologizing and all of that as well. Melinda, you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier too, kind of online resources that are really easy, very, very accessible. One again is the Human Rights Campaign. Their Welcoming Schools materials are really excellent for teachers, and also Gender Spectrum. Both of those entities have lists of resources, websites, and are really a great kind of one-stop shopping space. And as Mario mentioned earlier, you know, any of the listeners today are welcome to contact us, reach out, send us an email. We're friendly. We're always trying to share information. So that's another resource.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more questions in our Q&A feature here, but I have a question that I would like to ask you as kind of a closing question that I think would be good. So what's next for you in terms of, if you were to write a part 2 to your book, a sequel, what would you focus on?
I can speak briefly to this. So if there was a second volume, let's say, to this, I would definitely want to focus more on trans epistemologies of color, particularly, and how and what we can learn from that as individuals. How there's a lot of research out there, but there's very little on K-12 practices in education in working with trans youth, trans and non-binary youth of color. So that's one thing I would like to focus on.
And if Mario and I were editing this, you know, hypothetical book together, I think we'd also be looking for chapters that examine, for lack of a better term, red states, right? So looking in places where we feel like this work is less likely to happen, but actually is happening, and the ways in which it's happening, to try to understand, you know, how do trans activists, trans educators, allies, how do they do this work in the context of seemingly challenging political situations? And I think that would be a really important benefit. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it would be really useful to also look at, you know, family situations that are than supportive, right? That are still trying to understand, you know, what does it mean to be trans, and what does this mean for my child moving forward? So to look at some of those contexts as well. Easy to go to the places where the movable middle is moving quickly. But I think that's not the whole story. And I think there are really important stories in other contexts that have been unexamined.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you for this very important conversation. And thank you to everyone who attended and asked really, really insightful questions. And yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mayan.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to everybody that showed up. We appreciate it.
Bye.